abuse, and he did awful things to me. From the 19th century onwards, the government and churches were well aware of the risk that staff might sexually abuse residential school students. As early as 1886, Jean Lheureux, who worked as a translator for Indian affairs and a recruiter for Roman Catholic schools in Alberta, was accused of sexually abusing boys in his care. The officials responsible for the schools recognized that his actions were not appropriate. Despite this, there is no record of a criminal investigation being carried out at the time. When new allegations against Lheureux emerged in 1891, he was allowed to resign. In dealing with the matter, Indian Affairs Deputy Minister Lawrence Van Coffnet hoped it would not be necessary to state the cause which led to the same, that is, the resignation. When it came to taking action on the abuse of Aboriginal children, early on, Indian Affairs and the churches placed their own interests ahead of the children in their care and then covered up that victimization. It was cowardly behavior. This set the tone for the way the churches and government would treat the sexual abuse of children for the entire history of the residential school system. Complaints often were ignored. In some cases, where allegations were made against a school principal, the only measure that Indian Affairs took was to contact the principal. In at least one case, Indian Affairs officials worked with school officials to frustrate a police investigation into abuse at a school. When attempting to return some runaway boys to the Cooper Island School in 1939, British Columbia provincial police officers concluded there was good reason to believe the boys had run away because they were being sexually abused at the school. The police launched an investigation and refused to return the boys to the school. When Indian Affairs officials finally investigated, they concluded the allegations had merit. However, to protect the school's reputation, the local Indian Affairs official advised the suspected abusers to leave the province, allowing them to avoid prosecution. Nothing was done for the students who had been victimized or for their parents. These patterns persisted into the late 20th century. Officials continued to dismiss Aboriginal reports of abuse. In some cases, staff members were not fired, even after being convicted of assaulting a student. Complaints were improperly investigated. For example, charges of sexual impropriety made against the principal of the Gordon School were investigated by a school staff member in 1956. Church officials failed to report cases of abuse to Indian Affairs, and Indian Affairs failed to report cases of abuse to families. It was not until 1968 that Indian Affairs began to compile and circulate a list of former staff members who were not to be hired at other schools without the approval of officials in Ottawa. The churches and the government remained reluctant to take matters to the police. As a result, prosecutions were rare. In the documents it has reviewed, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has identified over 45 successful convictions of former residential school staff members who sexually or physically abused students. Most of these prosecutions were the result of the determination of former students to see justice done. The full extent of the abuse that occurred in the schools is only now coming to light. As of January 31st, 2015, the Independent Assessment Process, IAP, established under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, or IRSSA, had received 37,951 claims for injuries resulting from physical and sexual abuse at residential schools. The IAP is a mechanism to compensate former students for sexual and physical abuse experienced at the schools and the harms that arose from the assaults. By the end of 2014, the IAP had resolved 30,939 of those claims, awarding $2,690,000 in compensation. The Common Experience Payment, or CEP, established under IRSSA, provided compensation to individuals who attended a school on the IRSSA's approved list of schools. The CEP recognized the claims of 78,748 former residential school students. Although claims for compensation under the IAP could be made by non-residential school students who were abused at the schools, The vast majority of IAP claims were made by former residential school students. The number of claims for compensation for abuse is equivalent to approximately 48% of the number of former students who are eligible to make such claims. This number does not include those former students who died prior to May 2005. As the numbers demonstrate, the abuse of children was rampant. From 1958, when it first opened, until 1979, there was never a year in which Grolier Hall in Inuvik did not employ at least one dormitory supervisor who would later be convicted for sexually abusing students at the school. Joseph Jean-Louis Comeau, Martin Houston, George Masinski, and Paul LaRue all worked at Grolier Hall during this period. All were convicted of abusing Grolier Hall students. William Peniston Starr served as director of the Gordon, Saskatchewan residence from 1968 until 1984. Prior to that, he worked at a series of schools in Alberta and Quebec. In 1993, he was convicted of 10 counts of sexually assaulting Gordon school students. Arthur Pleint worked as a boys' supervisor at the Alberni Residential School for 2 5-year periods between 1948 and 1968. In 1995, he pleaded guilty to 18 counts of indecent assault. In sentencing him to 11 years in jail, Justice D.A. Hogarth described Pleint as a sexual terrorist. Physical abuse and sexual abuse often were intertwined. Jean-Pierre Balmar, who attended the Amos Quebec School, spoke for many students when he told the commission that he had been subjected to physical violence, verbal violence, touchings, everything that comes with it. Andrew Yellowback was sexually, physically, emotionally, and mentally abused at the Cross Lake, Manitoba School for 8 years. There was no single pattern of abuse. Students of both sexes reported assaults from staff members of both the opposite sex and the same sex as themselves. First-year students, traumatized by separation from their parents and the harsh and alien regime of the school, were particularly vulnerable to abusive staff members who sought to win their trust through what initially appeared to be simple kindness. In some cases, this might involve little more than extra treats from the school canteen. This favoritism, however, was often the prelude to a sexual assault that left the students scared and confused. Many students spoke of having been raped at school. These were moments of terror. Josephine Sutherland was cornered by one of the lay brothers in the Fort Albany school garage. Quote, "I couldn't call for help. I couldn't, and he did awful things to me." Other students recalled being assaulted in the church confessional. A student in the change room would suddenly have a bag pulled over his head. The abuse could begin with an instruction to report to the shower room in the middle of the night or to take lunch to a staff member's room. An abusive staff person might stalk a student, blocking his or her way, or grope a passing student. Female students spoke of how some staff members took advantage of their innocence, rubbing against them sexually while they were sitting on their laps. Abuse also took the form of voyeuristic humiliation. Some staff insisted on watching the students shower.